Dr. Matthew Gray is an assistant professor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University. He has participated in archaeological excavations in Jordan and Jerusalem and is currently an area supervisor at the Kukok excavation project, an excavation of ancient Jewish village near the Sea of Galilee. He received a bachelor's in Near Eastern Studies from Brigham Young University, a master's in archaeology and the history of antiquity from Andrews University, a second master's in Jewish studies from the University of Oxford, and a PhD in archaeology and the history of ancient Judaism from the University of North Carolina. So we want to welcome Dr. Gray.
Thank you. Great. Thank you very much. If I turn the lights down like that, will that work for everyone? Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the students for the Ancient Near East inviting me to come talk. Although I must admit that when I was first asked to come talk, it was just, hey, will you just come talk to some of our students about what your dissertation was on? I said, oh, that'd be fine. And next thing I know, there are all these really fancy flyers and videotapes and microphones and radio discussions. So anyway, I'm glad it's become what it is, and I hope that it's worth all of your while. This is a topic that I'm very interested in. When I was an undergraduate here at BYU, I started to become very interested in issues of ancient Jewish priesthood, ancient Jewish ritual, and the ancient Jewish temple. And this was an interest that developed throughout my years in graduate school. I was able to write various papers and various theses on aspects of ancient Jewish priesthood and the ancient temple. And it dawned on me by the time I was in my PhD program that one aspect of ancient Jewish history that just simply has not gotten a lot of airtime is this question of what happened to the Jewish priesthood after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. And so with that question in mind, I started to investigate, and I realized that there is a lot of very interesting evidence and information and insights that we can discuss relating to the fate of the Jewish priesthood after 70 that just simply has not gotten attention in the past. So I decided to write my dissertation on that topic, looking into that question, and it's currently a topic that I'm working up into what I hope is my first book. We'll see how long that process goes. But I'm very excited to talk to you about this topic today. And I'll try my best to hold it to about 40 minutes and then leave you about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So please hold any questions, and as you go, jot them down, and I'd be happy to chat about them afterwards. Before we can start thinking about the fate of the Jewish priesthood after 70, the first thing we need to remind ourselves of is how the priesthood worked in ancient Judaism immediately before 70. Just very simply stated, by the end of the Second Temple period, it's very clear that the Jewish priesthood and the priestly class in Jerusalem was not only the center of most Judean politics, but it was the center of Jewish worship. In the late Second Temple period, for most Jews, Jewish worship centered on the Jerusalem temple, its sacrificial cult, and a hereditary priestly class that served as the mediating link between the human and divine realms. This priesthood, this hereditary group of priests, was the linchpin in the covenant between God and Israel, and that was worship before 70. Of course, we all know that the year 70 was a huge year, very important year for ancient Judaism, because that was the year that, the culmination of the Jewish revolt against Rome, that the Romans destroyed the Jerusalem temple, put an end to the sacrificial cult in Jerusalem. And now the question becomes, well, what happened to this once powerful and incredibly influential priestly class? What I noticed as I started asking this question is that it seems that a narrative started to develop around this question, at least by the late 19th century. And this narrative that began to develop around the late 19th century began solidifying and just kind of became the traditional way that we talk about this in scholarship all the way even to the present day. And to illustrate how this traditional narrative went, I decided to choose a quote from Emil Schurer, who in the 1890s wrote a book, A History of the Jewish People During the Time of Jesus Christ, which in a lot of ways is still a foundational work in the field, at least in the way we teach it. And the way Schurer articulates this has become the traditional narrative. And in summary, the traditional narrative is this, that once the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, that virtually overnight, at least within a generation, that once powerful and influential priestly class lost all of its power, lost all of its influence, lost most of its relevance in the Jewish community, and that they were very quickly replaced by rabbinic Torah scholars. And ever since, we've been looking at post-70 Judaism as the era of rabbinic Judaism, and have viewed almost all literary and archaeological finds from that period through the lens of rabbinic Judaism. So this idea that rabbinic Torah scholars replaced Jewish priests as the leaders in ancient Judaism in the year 70, or around the year 70, has become the standard narrative. So here's how Scherer articulated that. He says, quote, "The overthrow of Jerusalem in 70 CE led to the suppression of sacrificial worship, and therewith the gradual recession of the priesthood from public life. The priesthood, now that it could no longer perform its temple service, lost its importance. It was a memorial of a past age, which indeed, as time went on, sank more and more into obscurity and decay. The Pharisees and the rabbis, these Torah scholars, entered into the heritage of the priestly Sadducees and the other priests. The priests, who had previously been the most influential in the direction and practice of religious duties, were now relegated to a condition of inactivity. All of the energies of the pious Jews, had now to be restricted to the doings of that which the rabbis prescribed to them." So we get this narrative of a very clear shift after 70, from priestly power, influence, and authority to rabbinic power, influence, and authority. And even though Scherer made this statement in 1891, we'll notice that textbooks that are still very much in use today in our own classrooms really haven't changed the story very much. In fact, here's a quote from Robert Goldenberg in his Origins of Judaism from 2007. This is a textbook that's very much in use in university classrooms today on ancient Judaism. Watch how the story is basically unchanged from the 1890s. Quote, "The political structure of Jewish life was destroyed in 70. The former priestly government had been swept away. The priesthood, now without function, would presently dwindle into a mere reminder of past greatness. Without the temple, the priests were no longer useful as national leaders. In the end, a new Judean leadership based on wisdom and learning emerged and came to bear the title of sage or rabbi. This new aristocracy of the Torah enabled a threatened heritage to survive its crisis and then once more to flourish." So we see that the story hasn't really changed. The narrative has basically remained the same since the late 19th century, that 70 was this turning point that marked the shift from priestly authority and influence to rabbinic authority and influence in Jewish society. Just as one final example of how this is still very much at the forefront of our thinking, the Erdman's Dictionary of Early Judaism from 2010, the most recent updated collection of studies on ancient Judaism, under its entry on priests, simply states this: "With the Roman destruction of the Second Temple, the priesthood came to an end." And with 70, we stop all historical investigation into what role, if any, priests might have had after that. So it seems to me that the narrative that kind of crystallized in the late 19th century has really been with us for a very long time, hasn't fully gone away. And the reality is, in our studies of ancient Judaism, after 70, the vast majority of scholars just have simply stopped looking for priests and stopped asking what role do priests have in society, because we're so focused on post-70 Judaism as the period of the rabbis, rabbinic Judaism, and most of the material from that period is viewed now through the lens of rabbinic Judaism. And that's slowly starting to change, but this idea of priestly participation in Judaism after 70 is one thing that has not yet emerged really in our studies. So let me just very quickly analyze this traditional narrative for you. And after some time of looking through these quotes and trying to figure out what makes these quotes work and what's the foundation, here are some observations that I made about this narrative. Number one, it seems to me that all of these narratives, or this narrative that we've been talking about, is based on the assumption that the Jewish priesthood was so inextricably connected with the sacrificial cult in the Jerusalem temple that once the sacrificial cult is no longer operative, that by definition we have no more use for priests. And so without the temple, obviously there would be no priests. There was that assumption that the temple is, or the priesthood is connected to the temple in a way that without the one you simply cannot have the other. That seems to be the first assumption of this traditional narrative. A second assumption of this traditional narrative is the idea that we can basically accept the claims of rabbinic literature at face value. Rabbinic literature, of course, is something like the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Palestinian Talmud, this rabbinic material that was collected between the 2nd and 6th centuries AD. And because so much of that material simply survives from this period, it's very easy for us just to take its narrative at face value. And of course, the rabbinic narrative is that after 70, they were in charge. Rabbis were running the show. Rabbis were scholars, judges, teachers, the mediators of divine will, and so forth. And it was very easy for scholars to just take that narrative at face value without considering the idea that rabbinic literature is actually one point of view in ancient Judaism after 70. And finally, I noticed that for almost every scholar who has made this statement over the years, this statement is always stated and it's never been argued. What I mean by that is starting in the late 19th century and onward, we've just said it. Yes, priests disappeared in 70 and they were replaced by rabbis. And we never demonstrated, based on ancient evidence, that priests in fact went away and did lose their relevance. We've never argued for that. We've just stated it and assumed it. So based on this analysis of the traditional narrative, I decided to look around, survey the ancient evidence, and ask, is this correct? Is this accurate? So in my dissertation, which I call Jewish Priests and the Social History of Post-70 Palestine, I surveyed this ancient evidence, and I came to a different conclusion. I found that based on the surviving literary, archaeological, and epigraphic or inscriptional evidence from the post-70 period, I find that there actually was, there's ample evidence that priests did not go away after 70, but that in fact for several centuries, that priests seemed to identify themselves as priests, they continued to participate in Jewish society as priests, and they just found alternative ways to function as priests apart from the sacrificial system of the Jerusalem temple. With that thesis, my dissertation, and now what I'm hoping to be my forthcoming book one day, I tried to do two things. Number one, I tried to assemble and analyze this ancient evidence for continued priestly activity after 70. And number two, I tried to basically ask the question, is it possible, based on the surviving evidence, to start establishing some kind of, even if a modest, historical framework for what are priests doing after 70? What can we say about them? How are they participating in Jewish society? And how are they influencing Jewish political and religious life after 70? And even though the evidence doesn't come to us like rabbinic literature comes to us in full-blown texts, I think that we can assemble the evidence in a way that allows a very interesting story of post-70 priestly activity to emerge, and that's what I'm hoping to do here. So let me give you an overview of my approach to this topic, and then we can discuss it at the end of the lecture. Before I move on to assembling this evidence, though, one thing that I wanted to do in this project was reevaluate that first assumption of the traditional narrative. Right? The traditional narrative we already described assumes that the priesthood was so inextricably connected with the temple that once the temple is gone, there's no more role for priests in Jewish society. Is that a logical assumption? Is that a natural, reasonable assumption? And I think the answer actually is no. If we assume that the Jewish priesthood was solely dependent on the existence of the temple, then we're actually ignoring a vast amount of material related to priestly responsibilities, even in the end of the Second Temple period. For example, we know that except for the priestly elites who lived in Jerusalem, we know that the vast majority of Jewish priests in the first century didn't actually live in Jerusalem, and in fact only served in the temple maybe between 2 to 5 weeks out of the whole year, which meant that during the rest of the year, the vast majority of their time, Jewish priests were doing priestly things that were not connected to the sacrificial cult. Some of these things included some of the legislation that comes down to us from the Torah, including setting priests apart as divine judges. Remember, in the law of Moses, it was priests based on their lineage who were set apart to serve as judges in civic and religious affairs. It was priests in the law of Moses and for those thousand years of tradition who were the recipients of tithes. It was priests who were supposed to be the teachers of the divine law. So priests had plenty of things to do apart from the temple system itself, and it seems that these things, priests serving as judges, as teachers, as recipients of tithes, as inspectors of purity, and all these things, it seems like these were the things that actually kept priests busy most of the year. So the question is, would the loss of the temple have automatically brought all of those things to an end? I think probably not. I don't see any reason why all of those priestly functions had to cease with the destruction of the temple. So that's point number one. Number two, it is interesting that by the late Second Temple period, priests were present in various aspects, in various strata of ancient Jewish society. There were priests in the elite ruling class in Jerusalem. There were priests in the aristocracy among the landholders throughout Judea and maybe even in some parts of Galilee. There were priests among the lower working class in various parts of Judea and along the coastal plain. So priests were spread out throughout economic strata, but also they were spread out geographically. And I again ask the question, would the loss of the Jerusalem temple have brought an end to those priestly dynamics? Or would those priestly families in those various regions have continued to survive? I think, again, it challenges that assumption. And then finally, it's important to recognize that priests in the late Second Temple period were active and present in various sectarian circles. The priesthood in the late Second Temple period was not a monolithic group. There were ruling class priests in the Jerusalem temple establishment who may have associated with groups like the Sadducees. The Essenes, the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, were clearly a priestly sect who had priestly interests and who believed that at least some of their leaders had priestly descent. There were Oneids. There were Zadokites. There were several groups of priests, priestly circles. Some priests joined the Pharisaic movement. Some priests joined the early Christian movement, apparently. So we have a wide variety of different priestly activities and priestly ideologies. And I again ask the question, would the loss of the temple have brought an end to all of those dynamics? I think, at best, that's a questionable assumption. So once I've tried to undermine that assumption that the priesthood was completely dependent on the temple by showing that there's a lot of priestly dynamics out there that would not necessarily have been affected by the loss of the temple, the next question is, do they in fact continue? Is there evidence that some of these Jewish priestly circles continue to exist after 70? And I think that the answer is yes. I think that if we very carefully look at our main literary sources, from the late first century and into the 2nd century and even beyond, the 3rd and 4th century. I think that we're going to find that there is evidence that priestly families and circles and ideologies and some practices do in fact continue. I'll just give you a few examples here. The writings of Josephus. A lot of times it's very easy for us to just assume that Josephus is our greatest source for the Second Temple period, and he is, no question about that. However, we need to remember that Josephus is himself an aristocratic temple priest who is writing his sources, who's writing his books decades after the destruction of the temple. Josephus's literature is actually produced in the 70s, 80s, and late 90s, 20, 30 years after the temple's gone. So Josephus is actually a great insight into how some aristocratic priests after 70 were still viewing Jewish life, and Josephus even gives us some hints as to where some priestly families went after Jerusalem was destroyed. We know that some priestly families continued to survive out in the countryside and continued to survive on the coastal plain. Josephus himself, as an aristocratic priest, was given lands by the Romans after the war in both Judea and along the coastal plain, so he clearly owned estates. And we also know that some of Jerusalem's high priestly families, the aristocratic families, were relocated by the Romans, actually during the siege of Jerusalem, to be resettled outside of Jerusalem in a location called Gophna. And so we know from Josephus that high priestly families had to be removed and relocated, but they were still very much alive and active and in some cases doing financially well still. We also know from rabbinic literature itself, if we carefully read through the Mishnah, Tosefta, and the Palestinian Talmud, what we realize is that in fact, some priests did seem to join the rabbinic movement. That is very clear. However, rabbinic literature itself describes the struggles that the early rabbis had wrestling over power and authority and ideology with other priests. So we do know from rabbinic literature that priests outside the rabbinic movement did exist, did continue to pose a threat to the emerging rabbinic leadership. And in some cases, rabbinic literature even tells us something about where these priestly circles lived. And we don't have time for all the details, but the material's there. In addition, both of these sources, both Josephus writing in the 90s, a few decades after the 70, and rabbinic literature compiled into the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, still describe priestly sectarianism in present tense. So, in other words, rabbinic description of Sadducees and Essene-like practices and Essene-like ideologies are never described as having disappeared in the ancient literature. Josephus, writing into the late 90s, still talks about the Sadducees and Essenes and the priestly aristocrats in the present tense as being still an active part of Jewish society. And rabbinic literature does the same. Rabbinic literature, of course, calls most of these groups minim, or heretics, but they're still being described in the present tense, which means they're still out there doing interesting things. And I think what we'll find is that a careful survey of the archaeological and inscriptional evidence will bear this out. In fact, we have several inscriptions indicating that various priestly circles after 70 were continuing to use the titles of priests in their funerary inscriptions and other things, including at Gophna, where Josephus tells us that these high priestly aristocrats relocated after the war. We have post-70 inscriptions at Gophna indicating that priests and members of the priestly courses did in fact relocate there. So I think if a fresh evaluation of the sources show us that it does seem that priestly circles continue after 70 in some very interesting ways. But that, of course, begs the question of, well, what are they doing then? So if they don't have a temple anymore, then, and we know that there are some priestly groups out there still doing things, well, what are they doing? What role are they still playing in Jewish society without the temple? And I think what we're going to find is that if we carefully look at the sources, that we have different groups having different visions for Jewish society after 70. And these different visions for society have different approaches on what they think priests should be doing in a post-temple era. For example, we know that Josephus, an aristocratic priest writing into the late 90s, is still endorsing a priestly system where priests, based on their divinely appointed lineage, were supposed to be the leaders in Jewish society, were to continue as judges, teachers, etc. And in that way, Josephus is trying to retain that biblical model, setting apart priests as leaders in Jewish society. Rabbinic literature, however, offers a different vision from this period. Rabbinic literature does want to, in fact, shift authority and power away from hereditary priests and onto themselves as Torah scholars. So in other words, it's a new vision for Jewish society based not on hereditary lineage, but it's a vision based on your scholarship. And as by virtue of being a Torah scholar, I should be judges, teachers, etc. So what we have in the literature are actually different visions for how post-70 Jewish society and national leadership should work. Let me give you just a few examples. In Josephus' latest writings, and I'm thinking of Antiquities of the Jews and Against Apion, both written in the late 90s, Josephus is still arguing for what he calls the Mosaic or the divine constitution, the constitution by which Jewish society should be led. Let me just give you a few passages from this, his description of the divine constitution as he sees it as an aristocratic priest. Josephus says, "Let me suggest that the way in which you may be happy and may bequeath to your children the eternal possession of good things, do not value more highly other arrangements other than what the present law is." And for Josephus, the present law is the law of Moses with its endorsements of priestly leadership. Let me give you a few more examples where he goes on. Josephus says, "What could be finer or more just than a system that has made God the governor of the universe and that commits to the priests," he says in the late 90s, "that commits to the priests in concert the management of the most important matters in Jewish society, and in turn that has entrusted to the high priest of all the governance of the other priests. These priests were the people to whom God entrusted in particular the worship of God. So what regime could be more holy than this priestly constitution? What honor could be more fitting to God, where the whole mass of people is equipped for piety and the priests are entrusted with special supervision?" So you see, he's still arguing to the very end, 2 or 3 decades after 70, that priests should still have tremendous amount of influence and power and authority in Jewish society. And by the way, you do get a sense that he's almost like you might be able to sense a little bit of polemics here, can't you? Where he's thinking, well, don't value other arrangements, probably because other arrangements are being made somewhere. And Josephus is trying to argue against that, it seems to me. We know that other arrangements were being made because we know from rabbinic literature that collects material from the late 1st, 2nd, and into the 3rd centuries. We know that the rabbinic constitution was something different. In rabbinic literature, they were envisioning a society led by Torah scholars. In fact, here's what Mishnah Avot says about Jewish leadership. The rabbis tell their disciples, do not crave the table of kings, for your table as a Torah scholar is greater than their table, and your crown as a scholar is greater than the royal crown. And your crown is even greater, greater is learning in the law than priesthood or kingship. Kingship's acquired by 30 excellences, priesthood by 24, but learning in the law is acquired by 48 excellences. Not entirely sure what that means. But the idea is clear. Scholarship trumps priests and kings. A bit of a different model than what we found in Josephus. In Josephus' constitution, priests were very much supposed to serve as judges. Here's what we read in Antiquities in the late 90s. In each city, Josephus says, 7 men should rule in each city or town or village who have previously displayed their virtue and zeal for justice. For each office, let 2 assistants be given to them from the tribe of the Levites. We still need priestly or Levitical supervision over our legal system, according to Josephus' constitution. In Appian, he says something very similar. The priests, he says in the late 90s in Appian, the priests have been appointed as general overseers, as judges in disputes, and with responsibility for punishing those condemned. Again, what regime could be more holy than this? Than the priests who will safeguard the law. They will adjudicate in disputes, and they will punish those who are convicted. Still very much part of Josephus' worldview. We don't have time to read all the rabbinic passages that talk about this, but it's very clear in rabbinic literature that the rabbis thought that your Torah scholarship should qualify you to be able to judge in civic and religious disputes. So again, 2 different worldviews that seem to be presented after 70. One more, and then we'll move on. Josephus claims, for example, in his constitution, that priests should continue to be, and he emphasizes, continue to be, even after 70, the guardians and teachers of divine law. Here's what Josephus says in Against Appian. Our ancestors took care over the scriptural records, assigning this task to the chief priests and the prophets. And how has this been maintained with great precision, even down to our own time, he says in the late 90s. And if one should speak with greater boldness, will continue to be maintained long after I'm gone. Right? I shall try to indicate briefly, not only did they, from the outset, place in charge of the scriptural matter and the teachings of scriptural law, the best people and those who are devoted to the worship of God, but they also took care that this priestly stock should remain unalloyed and pure. Naturally then, or rather necessarily, it is not open to anyone else to write of their own accord. This is a priestly prerogative. Well, of course, we know that the rabbis were doing just that, right? They were formulating their views of Jewish law based on their scholarship rather than on their divinely appointed lineage. Here again from Mishnah Avot, talking about the transmission of rabbinic law. Watch the chain of transmission and ask yourself as we're reading this, who's missing from the rabbinic view of the transmission of Jewish law? Here's how the rabbis tell the story. Moses received this law from Sinai, committed it to Joshua. Joshua committed it to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great synagogue, the rabbis. They said 3 things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up disciples, and make a fence around the law. So in the rabbinic worldview, divine law was passed down through Moses, Joshua, the judges, and onto the rabbis. Who's, of course, missing in this chain? The priests, the ones who actually were the safeguarding the divine laws for all those centuries, and who Josephus thinks should still be guarding the divine laws. So again, we have 2 very different models of authority and leadership presented in things like Josephus and the rabbis. Okay, unfortunately I don't have time now. I was just going to point out very quickly that in addition to the literary sources like Josephus from the late 90s and like rabbinic literature from the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, we also have inscriptions, many inscriptions from Palestine and the diaspora, which indicate that in fact these priestly circles continue to exist and thrive. For example, at Beit Sharim, which is a very impressive series of catacombs near the Sea of Galilee region, dating roughly from the 3rd to 5th centuries AD. A lot of scholars have focused on 2 catacombs in this system that has rabbinic inscriptions, and that's their way of saying, look, see, rabbis really are in charge. What they failed to notice, of course, is that there are actually just as many priestly inscriptions throughout Beit She'arim as there are rabbinic inscriptions. So again, it indicates that in fact, some of these priestly circles really are alive and well, and I don't have time to show you all of these, but it is quite interesting. But one thing that I do want to talk about very briefly is, so in this idea of having competing visions for Jewish leadership and competing visions for Jewish authority in the post-70 period, let me give you 2 examples that I think are very interesting. And both of these examples deal with attempts to rebuild the Jerusalem temple after 70. We all know that the most famous attempt to rebuild the Jerusalem temple after 70 was in the Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 135 CE. We've known for a long time this was a major revolt who had at its top of its list of priorities to rebuild the Jerusalem temple. But scholars have started to notice in the last few decades that in rabbinic literature, rabbis are ambivalent at best in their support for the Bar Kokhba revolt. In fact, most rabbinic texts openly mock Bar Kokhba. They call Bar Kokhba not son of the star, but Bar Kosiba, son of the liar. So it's very clear that some rabbis are very uninterested in the Bar Kokhba revolt succeeding, which begs the question, well, who's interested in it then? Who is supporting? If the rabbis are lukewarm at best in their support of the Bar Kokhba revolt and hostile to the Bar Kokhba revolt at least, then who's supporting it? In recent years, unfortunately, we don't have a Josephus who wrote about the Bar Kokhba revolt, so we'll have to do a little bit of investigative research here. But in recent years, we've started to learn more and more about the propaganda used by the leadership of the Bar Kokhba revolt in expressing their goals and desires and aims. We've known for a long time that the main leader of the Bar Kokhba revolt was a guy named Simeon Bar Kokhba, who wanted to establish himself as a Nasi, or a governor, over this new independent Jewish state that he was trying to attain. But recently discovered coins, and I say recently, in the last few decades, we've continued to discover coins minted by the administration at the head of the Bar Kokhba revolt, who not only lists Simon the Nasi as one of the leaders, but also lists a character named Eleazar the priest as a second leader of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Unfortunately, we know very little about who this Eleazar the priest was, but it's very clear from the revolt's propaganda, the coins that the administration is minting. It's very clear that at least part of the Bar Kokhba movement included a priestly component. They were not only trying to rebuild the temple, they were trying to re-enthrone the priesthood, possibly by creating what's called a diarchy, a rule of king and priest side by side. Now, once you start looking at the Bar Kokhba revolt in that perspective, you can see why the rabbis might have been a little uncomfortable. If the temple really gets rebuilt and the priesthood really gets re-enthroned, then they've just lost their claim to authority, right? Or there's certainly a threat to their claim to authority. So this idea of the Bar Kokhba revolt trying to establish Bar Kokhba as the Nasi and Eleazar as the new high priest suggests that at least some priestly circles were very active in military national politics into the 2nd century, and obviously had a stake in trying to re-enthrone the priesthood in the Jerusalem temple. So that's one interesting aspect of what some priests are doing after 70. They're participating in the Bar Kokhba revolt, at least some of them. It's interesting that there was a second attempt by Jewish circles to rebuild the Jerusalem temple after 70. This attempt comes in the late 4th century, under the reign of who we sometimes call Julian the Apostate. We know that Julian tried to rebuild the Jerusalem temple. We know that it failed. But again, we know very little about how this effort worked out and who was behind it. Again, just like the Bar Kokhba revolt, rabbinic literature from this period, and I'm thinking specifically about the Palestinian Talmud, doesn't mention this attempt to rebuild the temple. They certainly don't support it, even though they were aware of it. We do have a few hints that the rabbis are aware of the attempts to rebuild the temple. But in the Palestinian Talmud, which is roughly contemporary with this attempt to rebuild the temple, the rabbis don't make a single gesture of support for this idea, for this initiative. Which again begs the question, well, if the rabbis of the 4th century aren't actively supporting this rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple, then who is? Who is behind this? Who is going to benefit from rebuilding the temple in the 4th century? It is interesting to note that not rabbinic literature, but in fact Christian literature from this period tell us something about who might have been behind this attempt, this initiative to rebuild the temple in the 4th century. According to Syriac Christian sources that are roughly contemporaneous with this, Syriac Christian writers describe how it was Jewish priests from Tiberias who were actively promoting this initiative. Again, suggesting that priestly circles have not disappeared. They're still very active in Jewish society and are still very interested in promoting a priestly agenda. In this case, again, we need to rebuild that temple so we can get back to our sacrificial responsibility, something the rabbis were not overly enthusiastic about, but which someone, perhaps these priests of Tiberias, was obviously very much in support of. Now, it looks like our time is just about ended. Let me, because I wanted to leave some time for questions in case you have any. Let me just make one or two more observations. In trying to find priests after 70, and once we're now starting to assemble evidence that priests were still very active after 70 and in various circles, and please don't misunderstand, I am not suggesting that priests remained the ultimate power in Judaism after 70. I'm not suggesting that at all. I think that there were different social circles who had different visions of society, and for some time were struggling. I think that at some times rabbis became more influential, and that at various times patriarchs became more influential. But this is never to the exclusion of priestly circles, is all I'm trying to say. The priestly circles never did go away. They continued to influence Jewish society, and their fortunes waxed and waned, just like rabbinic fortunes waxed and waned, and just like patriarchal fortunes waxed and waned throughout this period. One thing that this allows us to do is this allows us to have an alternative lens through which we can now interpret evidence from this period. Not everything now has to be interpreted through the lens of rabbinic Judaism. If we find things like synagogues that we did not expect with extensive artwork and temple themes and cosmic imagery, if we find these things that we never would have expected from rabbinic literature, but now we know from archaeology, we no longer have to try to force something like this into a rabbinic worldview and say, well, maybe these are really liberal rabbi. We don't have to do that anymore, right? Now what we can do is we can just say there are different social circles out there who are doing different things and promoting different forms of worship and different ideas and different ideologies. And something like the Dura Europa Synagogue, which scholars are still struggling with, trying to identify who built this thing, who created all this extensive artwork that describes temples and priests and has cosmic tiles on its ceiling. And who did this? Well, now we can start taking its inscription seriously and recognize that it was priests who did something like that. We know from the dedicatory inscriptions of the Dura Europa Synagogue that, in fact, a family of priests, this is in 3rd century Syria, a family of priests, the priest Samuel and the son of Yeda'ah, one of the priestly courses, was the archon or the leader of this synagogue. And those who stood in charge of the work of this Dura Europa Synagogue were, in fact, the priests. Avram the treasurer and Samuel the son of something. So again, this provides an alternative lens through which we can view the Sephirist synagogue with its extensive cosmic iconography, including a zodiac wheel and the Helios and all sorts of real interesting temple images that we never would have expected to find from rabbinic literature, but yet here it is. Sephirist synagogue dating to about the 6th century AD in the Galilee region. And we know from its dedicatory inscriptions that priests and Levites were actively involved in building this synagogue. So again, we're starting to find evidence that, in fact, priests and Levites are a part of Jewish society, very much so, and promoting not necessarily rabbinic worldviews, but maybe their own priestly worldviews, still emphasizing things like the temple. We know that the Susius synagogue, with its extensive iconography, same thing, that the honored priests built this. The Na'aran synagogue, it turns out, with its zodiac wheel and temple imagery, its dedicatory inscription indicates that Phineas the priest built it. So what I'm saying is that there's enough evidence that's now starting to come together that we really can start saying something about the role of priests in post-70 society. And here are some of my conclusions before we open it up for questions. Number one, by reevaluating the traditional narrative and by assembling the evidence for post-70 priestly activity, I think it's becoming fairly clear that post-70 Jewish society in Palestine was actually much more diverse than was previously assumed. It's not all rabbinic Judaism after 70. There are many social circles after 70 promoting various ideas and preserving various types of traditions. And I'm not saying that priests were the ultimate. I'm just saying that priests were part of that diversity, that we can start recognizing that now. Number two, I think we can also now claim that priestly circles continue to identify themselves as priests and continue to function in Jewish society as priests for centuries after 70. My research ended in the Byzantine period. I was made aware in my studies that, in fact, this doesn't stop in the Byzantine period. In the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, into the early medieval period, priestly families in Tiberias were for 3 centuries running the academy in Tiberias. That suggests that they just really haven't gone away still. And I don't know when they go away, finally. Maybe they don't fully go away, actually, because in modern Judaism we still call people Cohens, and we still invite priests up in synagogues to give priestly blessings. So even in modern Judaism, which is now dominated by rabbinic literature and rabbinic thought, we've never been able to fully shake that priestly impulse. And then finally, as I've already mentioned, this research hopefully provides us an alternative lens through which we can view and interpret Jewish history after 70 without having to try to cram everything into a rabbinic worldview. We can now recognize that there are various groups trying to do different things, and when we find things like cosmic temple-oriented synagogues, we can now ask, could it be priests, in fact, who was part of this? Thank you very much. Okay, so we have, I guess, 7 minutes. Stephen and everyone else, is it okay to take questions, I guess, for a few minutes, if anyone has them? So, okay, great. Well, any questions or thoughts? Yes?
You mentioned with the attempt by Julian and Coptic to rebuild the temple.
Yes.
Syriac Christians that record as the priests.
Yes.
What is their agenda with this? What is their, by recording it, are they trying to make some statement?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was, for those who didn't hear, it was mentioned that Syriac Christian literature of the 5th and 6th centuries is what actually tells us that it was Jewish priests who were behind this attempt to rebuild the temple under Julian. What did the Syriac Christians have at stake in this? And that's a very good question, actually. A lot of times we've assumed, from the last century, we've assumed that when Syriac literature is engaging in polemics with Jews, they must be engaging in polemics against rabbis. In this particular instance, oh, there goes that. In this particular instance, these Syriac texts that I'm describing aren't necessarily arguing with rabbis over bits of Jewish law. They are trying to promote the efficacy of their own priestly authority. Syriac priests, Christian priests, have the efficacy to connect humans with the divine. And against that backdrop, now they sharply criticize and attack those Jewish priests who are still trying to do this. So they have definitely a different agenda, but in their polemics, we can suggest that Jewish priests are on the other end of their own attempts at legitimacy and authority. So very good question. Thank you. Question?
Dr. Gray, the question that I had comes back to some of the synagogues you talked about right at the end.
Yes.
Are there any differences that we find between that and a traditional rabbinic synagogue, those synagogues? And then a kind of follow-up question, if you could cover it as well. Is there any evidence that there were more priestly activities happening outside of the artwork within those synagogues?
Yes.
From the comparison to rabbinic?
Yes, very good question. So the question is, going back to the synagogue issue, how do these synagogues that seem to have had some kind of priestly influence in them, how do they compare with synagogues that have rabbinic influence in them? It's a very good question. What we notice in looking at architectural remains of synagogues from this period, especially in Palestine, is that we have vastly different arrangements of synagogue architecture. In some cases, some villages have synagogues that have no central focus, but have seating in the round, so seats along the walls, which would mean that the liturgical dynamic of that would be that we're all sitting around looking at each other, and there's no iconography in this particular type of synagogue. And it would seem to me, at least, that type of synagogue, where we're sitting in the round, community focus, maybe looking at someone in the center who's perhaps reading something, no iconography in the interior, that does seem to accord well with what we find in rabbinic literature, which, by the way, prohibits explicitly any kind of replication of temple images. It explicitly prohibits any kind of cosmic imagery. And so what we have is some synagogues that seem to adapt more to a rabbinic form of worship. In contrast, right down the street in some instances, we have other synagogues that have very much replicated temple features, who have veils hanging in front of shrines to separate space. You know, there's the congregation in the main hall, and then there's a veil that someone has to pass through to enter the shrine area. And it tends to be those synagogues that have extensive iconography invoking images of the temple, the priesthood, cosmic ideas of heavenly ascents, which is exactly what was going on in the temple in the late Second Temple period. And it happens to be that second type of synagogue where we find the priestly dedicatory inscriptions. So it seems that, and I don't want to say that there's always priest versus rabbi. I'm not trying to create that type of dichotomy, but it seems that in different Jewish communities, some would prefer more of a rabbinic style of worship, community-centered and iconic, form of worship, whereas in other synagogues and other communities, there were still Jews who were interested in promoting ideas of temple and priesthood, even if we could replicate that in a small way in a synagogue setting. Yeah.
The rabbinical Jewish following was against reestablishing the temple under the first 2 times you mentioned.
Right, or at least not supportive of it. Yes.
If they weren't supportive of the temple, what was their view of the ancient role of the temple in Judaism if they were against reestablishing the temple?
Yeah, it's a great question. No, there's no question that rabbinic literature reveres the glorious past of the temple, although it's very critical of the past of the priesthood. It's very critical of priests from the late Second Temple period, attacking them for their corruption and their corrupt ways or whatever. So it's very clear that they're interested in promoting a great memory of the temple, but it's also important to note that rabbinic literature is very interested in promoting the idea that we're going to take what was once in the temple and we're going to democratize it under our supervision. So, whereas in the temple, priests would do washings before their meals, no, I think we should all do washings before our meals under our supervision. So what we're doing is we're taking the old temple priestly imperatives and we're democratizing them in rabbinic Judaism. So they're very interested in the temple roots of Judaism, but I don't know that they're overly interested, at least in this period, they're overly interested in fact, rebuilding the temple, because that would mean a serious shift in power, I think. Yeah.
With that, what was the rabbinic view on the atonement of sin if they weren't doing temple sacrifices?
Right. It's rabbinic literature that reformulates it. It's rabbinic literature that says, whereas in the past atonement for sin was brought by temple sacrifices led by priests, now it's brought by Torah study and good works and charity. So we still have the idea of atonement, but we've just taken it out of the temple realm and into the daily life of most Jews. Well, it seems like we're out of time with the bell. I apologize for that, but if anyone else wants to talk about it, I'd be happy to stick around for a few minutes. Thank you for attending, and I sure appreciate your participation.